There are two Marilyns. One exists in photographs, films, and fantasies, eternal and untouchable. The other lived in shadows, terrified and tender, desperate for something the spotlight could never provide. The world fell in love with the first and destroyed the second. This is the story of that destruction, and of the fragile, beautiful soul caught between who she was and who we needed her to be. Los Angeles has always been a city of reinvention, a place where the desperate come to shed their old skins and emerge as something new, something glittering, something worth looking at. In the summer of 1933, a child was born into a world that did not want her. They named her Norma Jeane, a plain name for what everyone assumed would be a plain life. Her mother Gladys was a woman whose beauty had curdled into instability, whose mind fractured a little more each day, until she could no longer distinguish between the movies she edited and the life she was supposed to be living. Gladys loved her daughter in the abstract way one loves an idea, but ideas do not need to be fed or held or reassured. In the night, when the shadows grow long and frightening, the foster homes came quickly, one after another, each a temporary shelter that felt more like a holding pattern than a home. Norma Jeane learned early that she was a guest in other people's lives, tolerated but not treasured, fed but not nourished. She learned to read the subtle shifts in adult faces, the tightening around the eyes that meant she had overstayed her welcome, the false brightness in voices that meant another move was coming. She learned to pack her few belongings quickly, to say goodbye without tears, to walk into the next strange house with a smile that said she expected nothing because expecting nothing meant she could not be disappointed. In one home, she slept in a converted closet, the walls so close she could touch both sides with her arms outstretched. In another, she was told she was pretty but difficult, as if beauty and complexity could not coexist in a child. She watched the way men looked at her even when she was young, their eyes lingering in ways that made her skin crawl and her stomach twist. She did not understand it then, but she learned that her face, her body, the accident of her genetics, was something that provoked reactions in others, something powerful and dangerous that she had not asked for but could not escape. The orphanage came next, a building that smelled of industrial soap and institutional despair. The walls were pale green, the color of illness, and the windows were high and narrow, letting in light but not warmth. At night, lying in a row of identical beds filled with identical lost girls, Norma Jeane would stare at the ceiling and make promises to herself. She would not disappear, she would not be forgotten. Somehow she would become someone so luminous, so necessary, that the world would have no choice but to keep her. She found magazines discarded, in trash bins, their pages filled with images of movie stars, women who seemed to exist in a different realm entirely, a realm of silk and champagne and adoration. Jean Harlow with her platinum hair like starlight, Carole Lombard with her knowing smile. These women were never alone. These women were never invisible. Norma Jeane studied their faces with the intensity of a scholar decoding ancient texts. She practiced their expressions in any reflective surface she could find, learning to angle her face, to soften her gaze, to suggest mystery with the slightest tilt of her head. She was building an arsenal, though she did not yet know what war she would have to fight. The years moved slowly, and then suddenly, she grew into her body in a way that drew attention she had not sought and did not want. Boys at school stopped mid-sentence when she walked past. Teachers looked at her differently, some with concern, others with something darker. She understood that her appearance was both gift and curse, that it opened doors while simultaneously trapping her behind them. She married young, a neighborhood boy named James, who offered escape from the foster system. He was kind in his limited way, but kindness without understanding is just another form of loneliness. When he was deployed overseas, she felt relief more than sadness. The war transformed everything. Women flooded into factories, taking jobs that had been reserved for men, proving they were capable of far more than anyone had imagined. Norma Jeane found herself assembling aircraft parts in a noisy plant in Burbank, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind drifted elsewhere. Then one afternoon, a photographer arrived to document the women supporting the war effort. His name was David, and when he saw Norma Jeane, he stopped walking. There was something about her face, something ineffable and magnetic that the camera would love. He asked her to step into the light, and she did. She looked directly into his lens, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen. The modeling work began slowly, small assignments for minor publications, but with each session she learned. She studied the photographs of herself with clinical detachment, noting what worked and what did not. Her natural hair color was a mousy brown, pleasant but forgettable. She bleached it platinum blonde, that impossible shade that seemed to capture and hold light, that made her look like something not quite human, something celestial. She learned to move as if her body were made of water, fluid and unconscious. She learned to look at the camera as if it were a lover whispering secrets in the dark, and somewhere in this process of becoming, Norma Jeane began to recede. She needed a new name for this new creature she was constructing. Marilyn, someone suggested, after the Broadway star Marilyn Miller, and Monroe, her mother's maiden name, a fragile thread connecting her to a past she barely understood. Marilyn Monroe. She wrote it again and again on scraps of paper, spoke it aloud to test its weight on her tongue. It sounded like someone worth knowing, someone worth loving, someone who mattered. Hollywood in the late 1940s was a machine that consumed the young and beautiful, and occasionally, if they were very lucky or very ruthless, spat them back out as stars. Marilyn signed a contract with 20th Century Fox, a standard 6-month deal that promised $75 a week and nothing else. She was one of dozens of pretty girls they kept under contract, interchangeable parts in the dream factory. But Marilyn refused to be interchangeable. She took acting classes with Michael Chekhov, who taught her that the camera saw truth, that it penetrated artifice to reveal the soul beneath. She took voice lessons, deliberately cultivating that breathy whisper that would become her signature. She studied movement, learning how to walk as if the ground beneath her feet was sacred. The early roles were nothing, barely more than scenery. She played secretaries and waitresses, pretty girls who wandered through scenes and disappeared. But even in these throwaway moments, something happened. The camera found her. Directors noticed. There was a quality to her presence, simultaneously innocent and knowing, vulnerable and seductive, that made it impossible to look away. She embodied contradiction, and contradiction is endlessly fascinating. Then came the calendar, nude photographs she had posed for years earlier when she needed $50 for rent. The images were beautiful, classical, more art than exploitation. When they surfaced in 1952 after she had become famous, the scandal threatened to end her career before it had truly begun. Any other actress would have denied everything hidden, let the studio handle it with lawyers and threats. But Marilyn made a choice that changed everything. She told the truth. Yes, she said in interviews, her eyes wide and guileless. That is me. I was hungry. I needed money. Have you ever been hungry? And America, which should have condemned her, fell in love instead. The roles grew larger. She played Lorelei Lee in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, singing Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend in a gown the color of shocking pink, surrounded by men in tuxedos, and the image burned itself into the cultural consciousness. She stood above a subway grate in the 7-Year Itch, wearing a white pleated dress, and when the wind machine blew, Her skirt billowed around her thighs and she laughed, pure and unguarded, and that moment became the most famous image of the 20th century. Marilyn Monroe at the height of her powers, frozen in joy, forever young, forever radiant, forever just beyond reach. But what the photographs did not capture, what the films could not show, was the woman underneath. Norma Jeane was still there, still frightened, still waiting for someone to see past the platinum hair and painted lips to the girl who just wanted to be chosen. The world loved Marilyn, but Marilyn was a performance, a carefully constructed character, and Norma Jeane was drowning beneath the weight of maintaining her. She married Joe DiMaggio, the baseball legend, a man whose fame matched her own. He seemed strong enough to protect her, solid in a way that Hollywood men were not. But he wanted a wife who would stay home, who would be his alone. And she was Marilyn Monroe, who belonged to the world. They fought viciously, his jealousy colliding with her ambition, his need to possess her destroying what little peace they might have found. The marriage lasted 9 months, another failure in a long line of failed attempts to be loved for who she was rather than what she represented. She fled to New York, desperate for reinvention. Hollywood treated her like a beautiful wind-up doll, something to point at a camera and watch perform. She studied at the Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg, immersing herself in method acting, learning to access the deepest, most vulnerable parts of herself. She read Russian literature and wore black turtlenecks, and tried desperately to kill Marilyn so that Norma Jeane could finally breathe. When she performed scenes for the class, the other actors watched in stunned silence. She was good, genuinely talented, not just a pretty face, but a serious artist. Arthur Miller entered her life like a promise. He was the celebrated playwright, intellectual and intense, a man who seemed to see past the surface to something deeper. He told her she was brilliant and sensitive and misunderstood, and she believed him because she needed so desperately for it to be true. They married in 1956, and for a brief, shimmering moment, she thought she had found safety. But Arthur loved the idea of saving her more than he loved the reality of living with her. She was difficult, demanding, broken in ways that exhausted him. She took pills to sleep and pills to wake, her days a chemical tightrope walk. She could not remember lines on set, requiring dozens of takes, her co-stars and directors growing openly hostile. She found his diary one night, left open on his desk as if some part of him wanted her to see it. She read his words, his private thoughts about her, his frustration and disappointment and barely concealed regret. He wrote about her as if she were a case study, a problem to be analyzed and solved. He did not write about her as a person, whole and complex, and deserving of love simply for existing. The discovery shattered something inside her that could never be repaired. The films continued because films were all she knew. Some Like It Hot, where she played Sugar Cane with such perfect vulnerability that critics called it genius, even while condemning her behavior on set. The Misfits, written by Arthur specifically for her, a screenplay that felt like an autopsy of their marriage, his words dissecting her pain and displaying it for the world. She could barely function during filming. The Nevada heat was brutal, and she was weak from pills and depression and the unbearable weight of being Marilyn Monroe. Clark Gable, her co-star and childhood idol, was patient with her, but she saw the concern in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were made of glass about to shatter. When filming ended and Gable died of a heart attack weeks later, she convinced herself that her delays and difficulties had killed him, adding his death to the long catalog of her failures. She tried to end her life more than once. Pills and darkness, the seductive promise of an escape from the unbearable pressure of maintaining the illusion. Each time she was pulled back, hospitalized, treated for exhaustion, The public story always softer than the private agony. Her therapists tried to help, but how do you save someone from themselves? How do you tell someone that the persona they created to survive has become the thing destroying them? By 1962, she was cast in Something's Got to Give, but she could no longer perform even the basic requirements of her profession. She arrived hours late or not at all. She forgot simple lines. She seemed to be fading, becoming translucent, a ghost haunting her own life. The studio fired her publicly and humiliatingly. Marilyn Monroe, the biggest star in Hollywood, was suddenly unemployable. She was 36 years old and already being spoken of in the past tense. But then something unexpected happened. In the quiet weeks after her firing, something inside her shifted. She looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, and saw not Marilyn or Norma Jeane, but something in between, something that might be allowed to simply exist. She stopped dyeing her hair, letting the darker roots show through. She stopped wearing the elaborate makeup. She gave a series of interviews where she spoke in her natural voice, not the breathy whisper everyone associated with her character, and talked about wanting to direct, to produce, to tell stories from behind the camera where she could finally have control. She began writing, filling notebooks with her thoughts, trying to understand the journey that had brought her here. She wrote about the girl in the orphanage who promised herself she would matter. She wrote about the transformation into Marilyn, the deliberate construction of a goddess from raw material and desperate need. She wrote about the men who had claimed to love her, but loved only the reflection she provided. She wrote about the pills and the fear and the loneliness that came from being adored by millions and understood by none. She reached out to old friends, people she had lost during the chaos of fame. She apologized for ways she had hurt them, explaining that she had been drowning and did not know how to ask for help. She made plans to return to New York to study more seriously, to work in theater where craft mattered more than image. She talked about adopting children, creating the family she had never had. She spoke of a future where she was not Marilyn Monroe, superstar, but simply a woman, flawed and free, and finally, her own. The press mocked these plans, calling her delusional and washed up. The studio executives who had profited from her for years spread rumors about her mental instability. The men who had claimed to love her distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her fall from grace. But for the first time in her adult life, Marilyn did not care what they thought. She was tired of performing. She was tired of being two people. She wanted integration, wholeness, the simple dignity of being human. On a warm evening in early August, she sat alone in her home in Brentwood, the house she had bought for herself, the first place that had ever truly belonged to her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but something quieter and more sustainable. Peace, perhaps, or the beginning of it. She thought about the girl she had been, lonely and invisible, and the woman she had become, too visible, consumed by the very light she had worked so hard to generate. And she thought about who she might be next, if she was brave enough to step away from both versions and find something true. The phone rang. She let it ring. For once, she did not rush to answer, did not drop everything to accommodate someone else's needs or demands. She sat in the gathering darkness and listened to the sound fade, and in that small act of refusal, she felt a flicker of something like freedom. But freedom is a fragile thing, and the world does not easily release those it has claimed. The pills were still there on her nightstand, a rainbow of pharmaceutical promises. She had relied on them for so long that she no longer knew how to sleep without them, how to wake, how to function. She took what she thought was the usual dose, but exhaustion and confusion made her careless. She took more. and then more again, not intending to die, but no longer certain she wanted to fight so hard to live. When they found her the next morning, the world stopped. Marilyn Monroe was dead. The goddess had fallen. The icon had become mortal. The news spread like wildfire, and the planet paused in collective grief, mourning the loss of something beautiful and irreplaceable. But what they mourned was not the woman, but the image. Not Norma Jeane, but Marilyn. Not the complex human being, but the fantasy she had created. The theories came immediately, conspiracy and speculation, everyone trying to make sense of something that perhaps made no sense at all. Suicide, accident, murder, as if the how mattered more than the why, as if we did not all bear some responsibility for what we had done to her. We had demanded perfection and punished her humanity. We had wanted the fantasy and rejected the woman. We had loved her to death. But death could not touch the image. The films remained, eternally playing in revival houses and on television screens. The photographs endured, Marilyn frozen forever in her white dress, in her pink gown, in her knowing smile. She had wanted to be remembered, and she was, but not as the complex, struggling, brilliant woman she had been. She was remembered as Marilyn Monroe, the icon, untouchable and eternal, and ultimately unknowable. Her legacy is strange and contradictory, like the woman herself. She opened doors for actresses who came after, proving that beauty and talent could coexist, that sex symbols could be intelligent and ambitious and demanding of respect. But she also became a cautionary tale, her struggles with mental health and addiction used to diminish her achievements, her death used as evidence that fame destroys, that beauty is a curse, that women who dare to be both desired and powerful will ultimately be destroyed. She wanted to be an artist, and she was, though she never quite believed it. She wanted to be loved, and she was, by millions who never knew her mother, called her Norma Jeane, who never saw the fear behind the smile, who never understood that the woman they adored was slowly suffocating beneath the weight of their adoration. She wanted to be free, and in the end, perhaps she found the only freedom available to her, the freedom that comes when the performance finally ends. If she could speak to us now, across the decades that separate her death from our present moment, what would she say? Perhaps she would tell us that the distance between who we are and who we pretend to be can become fatal. That building a false self to survive is sometimes necessary, but always dangerous. That the price of being loved by everyone is often being known by no one. Perhaps she would warn us about the cost of perfection, the impossibility of maintaining an illusion, the way performing happiness can hollow you out until there is nothing left but the performance. Or perhaps she would simply ask to be seen, truly seen, not as an icon or a symbol or a lesson, but as a woman who tried, who survived a childhood that should have destroyed her, who built herself from nothing into something magnificent, who struggled and failed and tried again, who wanted the same things we all want, connection and safety and the simple assurance that we matter, who paid an impossible price for becoming unforgettable while losing the ability to remember who she had been before the world decided who she should be. Marilyn Monroe died at 36, but she lives on in ways both beautiful and terrible. In every woman told her value lies in her appearance, in every person who builds a false self to survive, in every artist who gives everything to their work and wonders if anyone sees the human being beneath. She is a mirror reflecting our obsessions with beauty, fame, and the performance of self that modern life demands. The lights of Hollywood still burn, manufacturing new dreams, creating new stars, but there will never be another Marilyn Monroe, not because she was uniquely talented or beautiful, though she was both, but because she was the original, the template, the first woman to show us what it costs to be worshipped while remaining human, what it means to become a goddess while still bleeding still hurting, still desperately wanting to be ordinary. Somewhere in the space between the two Marilyns, between the icon in our photographs and the woman in the shadows, exists the truth of who she was. A girl named Norma Jeane who wanted to matter. A woman named Marilyn who mattered too much. A human being caught between two impossible versions of herself, crushed by the weight of our expectations, suffocated by the intensity of our gaze, destroyed by the very love she had spent her entire life trying to earn. She gave us everything, her body, her time, her sanity, her life. She transformed herself into what we needed, sacrificed her complexity for our comfort, performed happiness while dying inside. And in return, we gave her immortality, which sounds like a gift, but is actually a prison, a way of keeping her forever trapped in the moment of her greatest beauty, never aging, never changing, never allowed to be anything other than what we decided she should be. This is her story, not as history recorded it, but as her heart might have told it. A story of two selves at war, of a girl who dreamed of being seen and a woman who could never escape being watched, of the unbearable weight of beauty, of the impossibility of being both goddess and human, of the price paid when we love images more than people, fantasies more than truth, perfection more than authenticity. She was Marilyn Monroe. She was Norma Jeane. She was neither. She was both. She was ours. She was never ours. She was a woman trying to survive in a world that needed her to be more and less than human. And in the end, that contradiction proved impossible to sustain. The two Marilyns could not coexist. One had to die so the other could live. And the one who survived was the one made of light and celluloid, the one who never really existed at all.